Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the next episode of Stream Time Sports. My name is Kristen. I'm the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now, Nick, are you familiar with the term hate watching?
Hate watching. Uh, I can guess what it means, but I don't think I've heard anyone use it in a sentence before.
Fine. I will give you what Google has defined it as. It is the act of consuming media, like a television show, film, or video, that you largely dislike or think is terrible simply because you enjoy laughing at its flaws, mocking its absurdity, or critiquing its shortcomings. I think in a sports lens, hate watching is watching a team you hate and hoping that they lose. That's the way I would,
Mm.
perhaps define hate watching, Nick.
I think hate watching in sports is definitely a thing. I can't think in this day and age people would hate watch TV shows because it's so bad. Like there's too much content now to watch to hate watch. But I could definitely see people tuning in to watch, if they're a Man United fan and watch
Yeah.
City lose a game against someone just because just because they're Man City. I could see that happening quite a bit. I can't see it happening in any other
You say that,
any
Nick, but
other
I think
settings.
I think like Love Island, like people joke about like how bad the TV show Love Island is. I mean, that's a show here in the UK, really bad dating show sort of thing. Um,
Yeah.
but I but I agree with you, Nick, because I was hate watching this weekend. I was hate watching Arsenal in the Champions League final. But I started thinking about like
Ah.
hate watching is actually really old because we talked about the power of someone like Tiger Woods. There were definitely people that hate watched Tiger to hope that he would lose back in the 90s and the early 2000s. Like I'm sure hate watching is an older term, but I've only recently heard it. But I think that's probably been going on for a long time. You think back with the Bulls back in the 90s, like hate watching has definitely got to be a thing.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a thing, whether or not it's been a turn, the phrase of hate watching is being used. But I am sure there's lots of people who tune into stuff, particularly around football and major sports, where they're basically watching, hoping that everyone's going to fail. Basically, at least they're big rivals. There's definitely a thing. I'm definitely going to see. I'm going to now pay more attention now if I ever start watching
Yeah,
any sports to see if I have that like negative mindset come in. Like I hope he
yeah,
fails.
yeah.
I have that issue watching golf sometimes. I do. There's a couple of golfers where I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, I really don't
Yeah.
like you. Hope
Yeah.
you hit a bogey here,
Yeah.
but not a whole match of sport or a whole live event.
Yeah, well, even with the hate watching, it extends beyond that, like, especially the creator economy. We'll talk a bit about Arsenal and Champions League final and stuff like that, but like, there's a really large argument for a long time
Mm,
that Arsenal fan TV could actually be viewed as negative because their ratings got better the worse Arsenal were because of the degree
yeah.
of hate watching. So, like, there's definitely, I think, in that creator economy, that sort of shock jock, sort of like trolling type of stuff that I think is definitely linked to hate watching.
Well, the Arsenal fan TV is a really good example. I do find myself sometimes watching like creators which who I hate and despise,
Yeah.
and I'm like, why am I watching these people?
Yeah.
And I'm hating what they're saying. I'm hating what they're doing. And yet here I am, and I've just watched this full reel or whatever it's been, and oh no, I'm definitely going to get served some of their crap again in sometime
Yep.
soon. But it's my own fault. So I guess that's another
I'm
form of hate watching, I suppose.
I know. I'm the same way, Nick. I find myself watching content and I'm just like, gosh, the algorithm's gonna send me more of this and I don't want to watch it, but I got no one to blame but myself, Nick.
I will blame. I will blame. I'm trying to be educated. Like, why is this person so popular? And I'm trying to get my head around
Yeah,
it rather
exactly.
than like enjoying the content. I think there is two different things there. So I'm giving myself a little escape clause.
I agree. That's why sometimes, Nick, I'm not going to get into politics. We're just going to pause it. Yep, we agree, Nick. But anyways, Nick, this last weekend I was hate watching. As someone that did not enjoy seeing Arsenal win, particularly as it came partially on their journey to see my West Ham United be relegated, I was hate watching this weekend, Nick. And there was a really interesting story that came out around the Champions League, and we will get into a little more detail around that. But today's episode just want to focus around the Champions League final, specifically from a broadcast perspective, because one of the stories that came out was in the UK that almost twice as many people, allegedly, because data can be hard to find, estimated, I should say, almost twice as many people watched it via legal streams as through the legal means via TNT Sports. So we're going to talk through sort of what that means from an industry perspective, not just necessarily specifically about piracy and combating piracy, but more about what happens when so many fans simply refuse to pay But before that, Nick, we are going to just talk a little bit about the Champions League. Just kind of painting the picture of where they are from a media business. I don't know, Nick, if there's anything you particularly want to say about the Champions League before I kind of run through some stats and figures, but just how you sort of view the tournament that UEFA has.
Oh, sure. Well, I think it's an interesting thing to discuss because what might have flown a little bit under the radar is since they stepped away from having team marketing lead all their commercial operations and strategy, they've lent into Relevant Sports, the US run, operated, and owned agency who's been doing their media rights work. That company is owned by Stephen Ross, who's the owner of Miami Dolphins. And since they've taken over the rights, they've done some interesting moves around their media rights strategy. And in this cycle, or the sort of the sales cycle they're currently in, it appears to be paying off. They appear to have seen and bucked the trend we constantly have been talking about of increasing media rights revenues in a number of different key markets. So it is an interesting one to look at, given I guess the sort of global or at least pan-European nature of the competition. They seem to be doing quite well at the moment in this current new phase of its media rights sales. So it does add some more question marks into where we're going as an industry, I think.
Well, speaking specifically around Relevant, they used to be with team marketing, I think, for nearly 3 decades. In that
Mm.
space of time, handing that over to Relevant, just to add some context to what you discussed there, looking specifically at the US, because that's a major market. We sort of talked about the US is really is a driving place for that. Actually, Nick, if you think back to our first Sports Pro OTT USA event, we went down to Atlanta at the Turner Studios, and that
We
was at
did.
the same time that they were having conversations because that would have been in 2021, just before the pandemic, which is
Hmm.
actually just before their Champions League rights came up. And they were talking about whether or not they were willing to get in a bidding war with CBS. But at the time in that deal that ran from 2018 to 2021, Turner Sports was reportedly paying $60 million a year for the Champions League. CBS then took it from 21 to 2024 for $100 million a year. But in the most recent cycle where Relevant have come in, their new deal runs from 2024 to 2030, which is now up to $250 million a year. So we're talking about some very significant gains in a US marketplace. And then you also referenced the wider scope of what they're doing. If we look at the UK, where we'll focus a little bit today, just given the story comes from there. In the previous cycle, they had been with TNT Sports. My understanding was is that was around $1.36 billion for their overall deal. I think that ran from 2022 to 2026, where we are now. The new deal with Relevant is running from 2027 to 2031 for 2.3 billion. So they've not quite doubled the amount, but we've gone from 1.3 billion to 2.2 billion. So just from a financial perspective, they are seeing their media rights grow, and whatever it is working with Relevant has led to some of the success that they agreed. So the Champions League does seem like a product that, despite other stagnation we've seen in European football, is continuing some of the trends we've seen with the Premier League being able to grow in the US, but they've also been able to buck some of those trends of being able to continue to grow their media rights values in Europe as well.
Yeah, they have really shown that there is a captive marketplace for those rights and willing to create a bit of a bidding war. I think it definitely helped. And I wonder if this was something they were aware of before they did the deal with UEFA, that Paramount was going to be looking for a way of coming into Europe and using sports as a tool. And it's clearly, whether there was luck or whether it was all sort of the stars all aligned nicely for them, and it was kind of something they saw coming through perhaps relationships that maybe Relevance leadership had with Paramount. They've come in and really reset the marketplace in terms of what those rights are valued. Some would suggest they've overpaid quite significantly in a lot of markets. Others will be thrilled that that money is coming into the ecosystem. It's going to be being spread across more of the top teams, across more of the top European competitions. But it's a huge win for UEFA, an immediate validation, I suppose, of them taking the big step away from team, which many were, I guess, not skeptical of, but were asking a question: how could they make that move when there was a team and UEFA were kind of seen as connected at the hip, very much intrinsically connected together.
Yeah, well, there's always, going to be concerns after something that long and then it ends. But looking to this specific Champions League final and specifically looking at the UK, I kind of wanted to be able to use this as an opportunity to take some bigger questions about the sports industry itself. Now, this was a landmark game, Nick, you know, particularly in the UK, having Arsenal there. Regardless of how I personally feel about Arsenal, I'd be lying if I didn't say that they are, you know, arguably one of the biggest clubs in the country. They're globally recognized, and they had the game against PSG, again, another internationally large brand. One of the things that was really interesting that came out of this, Nick, was the fact that there were 7 million viewers that watched the game legally via TNT Sports, and it's estimated that 16.2 million viewers came from illegal streams. I think they've said there's some around 3.7 million ISP accounts that they found watching that. So, Nick, I think one of the crazy things for me is that over twice as many people watch the game illegally versus watching the game legally, which is why this is such an interesting story. And I think just some context of this situation, Nick, and it's also kind of a big deal here in the UK. This is the first time the Champions League was not shown free to air. Historically, even though it was owned by TNT Sports and before that BT Sports, they still showed the games for free access, whether that was through the platform or via streaming on YouTube. This was the first time it was ever behind a paywall. So one of the things we will eventually talk about, Nick, is like how much of this had to do with the fact that the game got moved to a paywall between being free to air, and whether this is causation correlation, whether this is the reason why more sports should be on free to air. We'll kind of go through all those things. It is worth some additional context. I did mention that Paramount Plus will be the new broadcast partners for the Champions League. So for TNT Sports, they had no reason to really be concerned with scale because there's really no future monetization for it. So you can make the argument, just go behind a paywall because you don't have a long roadway for this product anywhere beyond this. Um, but Nick, it was just really, I think, damning those statistics, whatever reason you want to cut it, dice it, splice it, whatever, to see how heavily the viewership was towards illegal streaming for this.
Well, I've seen different numbers shared with regards to how much people watch illegally versus legally. And some of the studies I've seen around pay per view, if I remember correctly, were at least triple the amount of people watching pay per view events were watching illegally. So 3 times as many were watching illegally to watching it legally. Um, and this number, I mean, depends on how you want to look at it. It looks like 4 million, roughly 4 million unique IP streams. So let's assume that's roughly 4 million devices. Then you've got a couple of extra million people watching, assuming a couple of people per household tuning in. Then obviously you've got another 8 million people watching illegally, which dwarfs the number of people watching through traditional and official channels. It's a pretty massive number, isn't it? And look, I would say the legacy of this a little bit is that BT Sport originally and then TNT, but BT Sport, I remember talking to the leadership there, and they were always so proud of the approach that they took with those rights, where they had them free to wear through YouTube and through one of them traditional free to wear linear channels that was available. It was a bit of a no name, the name of it's on top of my tongue, but basically they was always made available. So they were always getting that reach. And I always assumed it was actually contractual that they had to be visible that way. But it sounds like from the language we're seeing come out of that it wasn't contractual, but it was kind of highly recommended, let's say, by UEFA as part of keeping the relationship strong. But obviously, it's a bit of a screw you to UEFA, it feels like, doesn't it, to TNT to say, well, you know what, we're not going to do that because we haven't got to deal with you anymore. We want to try and basically milk this opportunity for everything that it's worth. And they, I guess, if there's no legal reason for them to have it free to air, they've got every right to take the approach that they've taken. Whether it's driven the amount of subscriptions they want, I did see some press releases coming out from TNT talking about all the other amazing sporting events they were having that weekend to try to build out this narrative around now's the time to subscribe to TNT. But innately, these things don't go down well with fans. Even if they have subscriptions to these platforms, they don't like seeing the fact that they feel like the market's being milked in a way, which is not a nice way to frame it, but it is the reality of what it is.
Yeah, and just to provide some historical context within the UK, the record viewership, which people thought could have been pushed for, just given who the finals matchup was, because there is a degree, if you look at viewership of the Champions League final in the UK, if there's no team from the UK, the viewership drops off. But having Arsenal against PSG, there's an expectation that this could do really big numbers. So the fact that it only did 7 million, to give you an idea, the all-time record was 12.6 million viewers in 2022. That was Liverpool versus Real Madrid. So again, prominent UK club versus global powerhouse. In 2019, we actually had a Liverpool v Tottenham, so an inner UK matchup came in at 11.3 million viewers. 2021 was another UK matchup between Chelsea and Man City at 9 million viewers. So we've seen these numbers be significantly higher, maybe not significantly, but not insignificant numbers in terms of viewership, where I think you could draw a bit of a correlation between the switch from free to air, or from free to air to being behind a paywall. Now, it is interesting, Nick, that the numbers in France actually dropped despite PSG being featured in both of those from last year to this year. One of the arguments has been that the game kicked off locally at 5 p.m., which is just not prime time, and how much that has had an impact on it. But Nick, I know some people will point to that because the viewership did drop off in France, but it's hard for me to believe that the reason the numbers didn't hit in the UK was the fact that there was the move from a free to air broadcasting strategy perspective, whoever that was, to being behind a paywall.
I mean, coming back to the concept of them starting earlier, I think it's a really interesting um, thing to talk about because they've made that decision for a reason. My theory is that they made it because they want to reach younger and family-led audiences, ensure that bigger groups are tuning into it than having it too late in the evening. Otherwise, why, frankly, would you do it? It's too much of a risk if you've got less people. It's not in a key ratings window. It's not when the peak of TV audiences is tuning in. Why else would you do it? Now, the theory could be, this is just a theory, is that some of the broadcasters might have already had other content that works really well in that peak window anyway, because that is a peak TV window. So by having it at 5 o'clock, maybe it brings audiences to TV that wouldn't be tuning into TV otherwise at that spot. So that's one of the theories that I think that maybe they're happy to have lower ratings from the broadcaster's side because it's actually delivering significantly more than what they would usually get in those time slots. That's a theory that I'm not sure has any substance or not, but I'll go with that.
Yeah.
I think that the number I saw, which is 7 million viewers for the UK, versus the numbers you shared. Now think about that is through a paid channel. That is, I think, pretty strong. That shows the level of reach that TNT has, which is much higher than I guess I thought that they did have. I think I did some initial estimates looking at some numbers and was thinking that might get to 5, but they get to 7 million with a platform that is primarily behind a paywall is for me really impressive. I think there are some asterisks along that, which is I think it was free for Virgin Media users. Now Virgin Media
Correct.
is one of the leading telcos here, so that definitely opens up the number of people that are being made available or being made available to see it. But I'm not sure the number on that. They'll never share those numbers. They don't often share those numbers, I should
Right.
say. So, but if you then compare the record number, which you said it was 12.6, with that
Correct.
illegal number, then actually basically you're looking at a number that possibly is a record. But we can never compare apples with apples
Yeah.
like that. It doesn't really play out that way. But it is intriguing to think what if, and I do wonder, we were talking about this the other day, whether or not if you're a brand, are you reporting the full reach that is being estimated here with the pirated streams to your board when you're sponsoring a competition, or do you just stick to the official numbers? I know typically sponsor execs like to use the higher numbers when they can.
It is really interesting. And someone sponsorship's going to have to discreetly tell us what number they choose to use, because I'm not sure even the broadcast partners would appreciate if they're using pirated numbers for the reach that they're getting.
Yeah, I do really am intrigued by that. I know there's some interesting companies that help give visibility on the total reach, particularly on social media channels with content that might be repurposed, so you can track the
Yeah.
analytics on that. But also through pirated content. Ripple Analytics is one of those, which used to be video sites who we've had on the podcast before. They are really good at bringing that sort of intelligence to the table to get a sense of how accurate that reach is. Yeah, but I am intrigued to see how that reporting goes. I mean, sponsor execs will tell you it's not just all about the views and the reach and so forth, but those numbers, big numbers, really help
Yeah.
justify budget spend quite a lot.
Yeah. So just trying to reframe this and talking a little bit about piracy, but also just talking about the economics of sports from a broadcast perspective, Nick. We know that this is growing. We know that's part of the reason why Ligue 1 has had struggles in France, is because of how prevalent piracy is over there, and broadcasters not wanting to invest too much into something they didn't know. And obviously, this Champions League, provide some more statistics to that? You talked about some of the pay-per-view stuff, although pay-per-view, who knows what's going to happen with that with boxing and the what direction it's going. But the point being, Nick, is are we dangerously or scarily getting close to a point where the illegal audiences are the quote unquote real audience for premium sports?
Oh gosh, that's a juicy question.
Yeah.
I look, I do genuinely wonder how sports should really be looking at reviewing its reach and its audience for those very reasons. And it does come back to that existential question on, can we find a way to drive monetization and value out of reaching mass audiences through official means that makes it accessible and still drives enough return on investment for everyone involved. That is still not achievable at the moment. And therefore, this approach, where someone like TNT is willing to put it behind a paywall to drive acquisition and miss out on millions and millions of viewers on their channel, is a more effective approach to monetizing premium live sports events. The reality is, we know that is not necessarily a sustainable model, and hasn't been for some time, for the wider sports industry, and that's where things do need to change. So, look, not everyone's pirating sports streams. The ones that
Mm.
are getting most pirated are the ones generating the most media rights revenue. So it's a really intricate, weird ecosystem. But I do think if frankly, if sports are focusing on monetizing the maximum reach they get. And it's genuine reach, as people, whilst it is illegal, people are watching because they want to
Yeah.
watch the content, they want to consume it. It's just an interesting predicament that I don't
Yeah.
know how you can turn into ways of working, because we all know the realities with piracy. It ain't going away, and it's probably getting harder and harder to fight before it's getting easier.
Yeah, and one of the things, it blew up on your LinkedIn, sort of your dreams and realities for the sports industry, and a lot of people commenting on that. You've republished it in a couple of different ways. One of the things you talked about is we as a sports industry need to stop talking about owning fans. So I'll use the word own in parentheses. So we kind of, if there's more people watching illegally than legally, who actually owns the audience? Like that's a bit difficult. Like, again, we have a bit of a weirdness about saying own fans, but you get what I'm saying.
Well, I do get what you're saying, but I get on my high horse a little bit
Yeah.
about this, because I think we have to emphasize that no one owns their audience. No one owns a fan, despite the language we like to use. We have owned and operated platforms where fans might come and check out our content, but we don't own the fan. We don't own even the fan relationship. They come to us in different instances because they want to consume something that is relevant to them at any point in time. The privilege of having them come onto the platform and consume and watch our stuff is their way of paying us for the right to do so. And that is the tricky predicament. But that has been the way that sports has been monetized for a long time, primarily through sponsorship revenues, because of that mass reach, irrespective of how people are consuming it. The opportunity to be connected with sports, the most powerful, piece of entertainment from an emotional connection perspective there is in today's modern media landscape. That association is everything to be part of that. And frankly, that's why we have to find better ways of monetizing through that approach, rather than thinking that we need to own this relationship. Getting data points to better understand what people want, 100%, but don't pretend you own them. You don't own them. Now, there is kind of like a different type of relationship that exists between clubs and fans than it does between leagues. And I think I could give like a little bit of a leeway to some clubs that have season ticket holders and
Yeah.
fans that live and die by the club. That's probably as close to owning a relationship as you could classify. But go to the fan and ask, do you feel comfortable that the club says they own you? You'll know the answer.
Yeah. Very much so. Very quickly, you might find out the hard way. And in terms of piracy, Nick, in terms of what's driving in, using this as a particular example, how much if we got a pie, you gotta split the pie up. How much of it is around cost versus sort of fragmentation? And I guess barriers, um, to accessibility and how difficult things can be. Because I think almost like pay-per-view back in the UFC boxing days, that could be like, at least in the US, because it was prime time, could be like 100 plus dollars to do something, like not a cheap price. I don't think it's quite what this is, but like it's more just how many different apps and things you have to have. What do you think is a bigger issue at the moment between pricing versus just the experience, the fragmentation, and just I guess, like I said, accessibility.
Well, I think that's one of the big issues here for any, let's say, Paramount coming in and wanting people to sign up to the platform. I think they're going to have to spend more than anyone to get people to come to the platform, because I just think there is subscription fatigue really right across the industry, and not just for streaming platforms, but also with even on your phone. How often are you downloading new apps today? I rarely ever download something unless I have a real definitive
Yeah,
utility for that app. Otherwise, I'm spending more time uninstalling to create some more space on my
yeah,
phone more than anything. But think about that, and then think about these other subscription products. We go back a few years ago. I would download apps much more regularly just to see, oh, what's this like, and do I want to, is it worth my time, basically.
yeah,
Now I just don't do it. I want to get off my phone. I don't want to stay on my phone for no
yeah,
reason. And that's why I think anyone coming into the market now is going to find it difficult to push people into subscription unless they've got something that truly moves the needle. So yes, if you're an Arsenal fan and you want to watch them in Champions League, you probably will buy a Paramount subscription next year. But if you're an entertainment fan, a football fan, are you going to buy just to watch the Champions League? I think it's so much less likely that you're going to make the effort to subscribe to a new service if you have all of the other ones already available to you. And that's the predicament I think that many are going to struggle with. So if I was Paramount, I would keep spending, frankly, and try and win some more of those rights away from others who can move the needle, because otherwise I might fall a little bit short in their expectations in some markets where they've really gone hard at Champions League rights.
I will come back to Paramount, Nick, and what they specifically should do next year for the Champions League final once we start talking a little bit more about monetization models. But just kind of one last question on piracy. And I think, actually, I don't think I know. I've had people message me and talk to me and say they feel like I downplay piracy sometimes, that I don't take it seriously enough, or that they think my opinion
That you
is
don't, that you're downplaying it. Phew.
no, but they think that they feel like my language is normalizing piracy is what
Ah,
the argument is,
yeah.
which I just think like that's just your perspective. That maybe you might think I'm in denial, or sorry, you might think I'm normalizing. I might think you're in denial. But
Is
anyways,
this friends or is this people in the industry?
people in the industry, I've had people message me when
Yeah.
we've done podcast on
But I can understand
privacy.
that. I can understand
Yeah,
that because we've been talking about it for so long,
yeah,
though, and I think I don't know. I want to put words in your mouth. I put
yeah,
words in my mouth
yeah,
and say it on our behalf, or at least
yeah,
my behalf. Is that we've been talking about this for ages, and everything points to that piracy is normalized in
yeah,
consumer landscape, and that's the problem.
yeah,
We don't have the solution to get over it.
yeah,
If you've got a solution to solve piracy, we are all ears, because it's a huge problem for the industry. It's the biggest one. The problem is I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. So if anyone knows what the light at the end of the tunnel is, I think the at the end of the tunnel is a fundamental change in how content is monetized digitally, moving away from subscription and so forth. It isn't trying to solve piracy, because it is you can what's it called, damage limitation. You
yeah,
can limit the damage of piracy, and there's lots of great companies that do a really good job with that. I probably don't point that out enough. These numbers would explode even further if there wasn't for those companies that do
yeah,
work in the background making that happen. But the problem is there's a consumer mindset problem. There is a technology gap. There's a lot of issues
yeah,
that around piracy that we have covered, and I don't think
yeah,
normalized. I think we have talked about
yeah.
them. There's a real predicament that is not going away, and that's why I think I feel a little bit defeated by the whole notion of
Yeah.
like trying to solve piracy rather than through other means, other than let's come up with a new way of working.
Yeah, I think for me, I I don't think you can police a market product problem. That's sort of my take on it, is like
Mm.
I think we're kind of at a point now, like technology is incredible. I've not quite really seen any technology that's stopped at this point. Like I don't think we can. So I think trying to police a market product pricing issue is different than trying to do it in a different way. So yeah, it's not that I'm normalized. It's just I feel like, so for example, the reason I brought it up, Nick, is because there was a recent survey where it said 58% of the UK population thought that piracy was acceptable. So I guess the argument is when that many people believe that, like, have you lost the moral argument? And I don't mean lost the moral argument in the sense of that I am saying theft
Well, you're
is
losing.
a moral thing, but if people don't believe it, it's hard to use that as a stance in the sense of people don't care. So I guess the question is like, have you already lost the moral battle if that many people really truly believe that?
Well, I think you're definitely losing the moral battle, and the thing I haven't worked out, I've not seen any good examples of really is a communications approach that lands with the consumer, with the fan, to say, hey, by you watching illegally, the result of that is X. Because frankly, what they see is athletes getting paid more, owners getting richer with higher valuations, and basically the numbers going up and up and up, right? So I
Right.
can understand from their point of view why it makes no sense for them to do it if they can get access to it in a pretty straightforward fashion. And frankly, yeah, so
Yeah.
really it in a nutshell for me, is that there's that divide there that we need to find a way. If you're ever going to try and shift people away from piracy, is how to communicate to them.
Right.
I think in reality that is nearly past the point of no return, and instead it is about finding another way altogether.
Yeah. So Nick, we're talking about sponsors. We talked about it. Sponsors want reach. If you're putting a paywall in front of things, are you ultimately undermining the sponsorship value? And I guess sort of the other thing about this as well is, if you're putting the biggest matches behind a paywall, you're sort of battling short-term revenue versus arguably long-term sort of audience erosion loss because, they might look for other means. It's just obviously, Nick, we're not saying we're anti-paywalls. Like there's lots of, very good businesses based around subscription. So we're not doing that. But I think specifically talking events like a Champions League final. Like I couldn't imagine if the Super Bowl all of a sudden went behind a paywall, like stuff like that. Like more talking about those really key premium moments. Um,
Mm.
whether or not you should be putting them behind a paywall, Nick.
Well, look, I think it comes down to there's a couple of things. One is that pay TV, paywalled based platforms like TNT and alike, have been the driving force for innovation on the broadcast product, particularly in UK and Europe and many markets where pay TV is so prominent. So without that investment, they've been able to receive by people paying a premium for their services, they've been able to transfer that into building a better product than what, say, you would get if you just watched a live stream of a tier 2 or 3 competition through YouTube, right? It's a better premium product in a lot
Yeah.
of different ways. So that has allowed it to be invested back into building up the quality of entertainment we all receive today. A decision has to be made by every rights owner, how they want to monetize basically the operation to make it successful. Now, you can go with a model which is as much front of the paywall and free to access and in many places as possible, and monetize purely on a sponsorship led, reach led approach. But typically, that is leaky, let's say, or inefficient, to instead having a more blended approach. So, monetizing some of that through making sure there's enough critical mass and reach to give you that visibility, so brands are interested in that globality and that reach that they can't get anywhere else, and through services that need a premium sports product like a premium product like sports and live sports to move the needle to drive subscriber retention and acquisition. And as we've seen for a long time, it's a blended approach that seems to drive the most value. It leads to fragmentation, though, but that's the reality of the environment we have, and sports has made a lot of good money out of that for some time. But given the content trends that we're seeing, I just feel like that's going to be trickier and trickier unless you are a true needle moving event like the Champions League final, like the Super Bowl, like other events that do get people's attention no matter who you are, not just the fan, the top tier fans. And that's typically what people look at it through that lens, is the people that would go to watch any Arsenal match. Well, how do you get me, who doesn't watch Arsenal, who doesn't watch
Yeah.
PSG, who doesn't watch EPL, doesn't watch Ligue 1? How do you get me to watch your game? It ain't going to be if it's paywalled and on a platform I don't have access to, right? It's got to be something that's a bit more accessible. And that's the predicament why having free to air can also reach a much wider net of audiences, which is appealing to major global brands.
So Nick, let me put you on the spot. You're the head of Paramount Plus in the UK. You're coming up. It's it's March of 2027, and you've got to pull the trigger on whether or not you're going to put the game free to air on Paramount Plus's YouTube channel. So you're at least trying to stay within your. Are you going to keep the game behind a paywall, or are you going to put it back free to air? Just putting you on the spot, Nick. Knowing what you know now.
Okay, assuming there is now ad breaks allowed by FIFA in
Sure,
the
we got
Champions League
hydration breaks. Yeah.
finals, hydration breaks, then I would go with going for it free to air. I think you get a resurgence of audience, good marketing for Paramount, that they've made it accessible. So TNT's basically given them like a little olive branch now
Yeah.
to say, look, we're nicer than them. We're giving you this free to access, but I suspect they would make it free to access perhaps on their platform, maybe. So you are driven on the platform, maybe make a decision, a bit like DAZN did with the Club World Cup to try and get people on
Yeah.
the platform first, but for free.
Yeah. All right. So, Nick, let's talk specifically about media rights. Doesn't have to necessarily be the Champions League, and talking about the impact from a piracy perspective on this. If significant percentage of fans are not willing to pay for subscriptions, can we make the argument that rights are fundamentally mispriced?
Wow. Yeah and no. Ultimately, there's really smart people who have all access to all the numbers from a pay TV perspective. They see what impact sports and sports events has. There's a reason platforms like Netflix are leaning into sports more, because they see what happens when sports is used as a platform to drive audience acquisition and to see the impact on churn. So clearly it has an immense value. So no, I don't think media rights are mispriced. I do think, though, there's a misalignment on expectations when you're a lower tier sport trying to drive the same amount of inertia behind you. But we've talked about that in a few different examples. But I think media rights are, they have calmed down. We haven't seen, in general terms, there's a few outliers which we've talked about, but it isn't like a lot of markets going from 100% of value from the last cycle to 50%, exceptions being France and well, basically France on the football side. So I do think there's inherently still value there, and all the streamers and big tech companies are looking to own more attention, and sports is the best driver for that. So I don't think they're mispriced. I think we've seen the Champions League get a nice little boost in this cycle. So who knows? I still feel bullish that if the the approach, the mindset, the money that exists in the American sports advertising ecosystem somehow makes its way to Europe, then you could see a real boost in media rights revenues in a multitude of ways. But the whole ecosystem has to change with it, which is there's lots of stakeholders to manage there. So I think it's about right.
Well, I had a couple follow-up questions, but I imagine we're probably going to answer those in the sense of, kind of, are broadcasters overpaying for rights based on inflated assumptions about exclusivity? Because some of these, you're paying exclusive rights, but obviously it's not exclusive because, as we mentioned, you don't know in the fans. Piracy is very prevalent. And then, if premium rights are leaking massively, what exactly are broadcasters buying? But I think you just answered kind of the question there, that you probably bake that into the assumption when you're doing your pricing that you are going to lose all that. You're not going to have 100% exclusivity. Or I think, to the point that you mentioned in France, that there's a reason nobody invested in Liga, and probably because they are making assumptions that they aren't paying for exclusivity. So I guess, Nick, for those questions about whether they're being overpaid for, maybe they are still being overpaid for in your opinion. But just sort of where you
Well,
fall.
just to jump in there, I would say the difference is, in a market like France, they were trying to you need the perfect mix of competition for media rights if you want to get more value. In this instance, with Paramount Champions League, Paramount wants to really go big in those markets. It needs something. So naturally, it's going to drive more competitive tension and a higher bid, because each subscriber, it's got a much higher propensity of securing new subscribers by having those rights. If you're a mature platform, let's say like Canal Plus, which has a hugely mature audience, is very sticky, it's not going to lose people overnight just by losing football alone. They don't get as much value back basically by spending the same amount on those rights, like a new player to the market would. So inherently, that is just one of the big things, that you need the competitive market tension. You need to have extra reason, or extra ways of driving value back. And that is, quite frankly, if you're a new player and you get a new subscriber and you hold on to them, that's worth a much more to you than someone who's got an established audience that doesn't churn a lot, and probably won't churn a lot if you lose those rights anyway. I think that's ultimately where the predicament is for markets like France and others in Europe, where it is a bit of a slower moving market. And that's why Paramount might be trying to pounce.
So, if we're talking, Nick, about piracy, and you and I think have kind of agreed that it's going to be hard to police it from a legal perspective because we've seen how sometimes slow that can be. And because live sports is so fast, by the time you can enforce it, it's too late, or governments don't necessarily punish it severely. We've sort of said it doesn't seem like we're ever going to be at a point that technology will be able to sufficiently stop it. So where do we need to be focusing, or where should the sports industry be focusing on? Is it around innovative approaches towards pricing? Is it about user experience? I think it's one of the things we talked about when we spoke with Media Kind is, can you make the viewing experience with so many additional features so good that someone's willing to pay for it? Is it bundling it with other broader entertainment? Where should sports be looking if we're not confident that it can necessarily be policed or stopped through a technology means?
I definitely think that it is a bit of a sum of all those parts. I think having a really solid product, let's say we'll use the NFL's Game Pass or
Yeah.
Sunday ticket proposition, right? It's got so much there that it just offers more something that you can't get anywhere else. For those real fans, it's built for those top tier fans, basically, as an example. You need to add those layers of experience and quality to make the product premium, so it's worthwhile going to. But I think what I'd like to see is more trialing of making content free on platforms, more trialing of things like a bit like the YouTube and TikTok approach, but on their own platform. So Paramount, for example, could put a game available for 5 minutes or a couple of minutes on their
Yeah.
platform, just dump on, super frictionless to get on, like one click and you're in the platform and the game's playing. And then maybe in a couple of minutes start asking them to subscribe rather than being behind a proper paywall. I don't see enough of that activity. It might be happening, but I've just not seen much of
Yeah.
that. And I think if they can reduce the friction to get it going on the platform, and it was like 1 or 2 clicks for me to just sign up when I'm in the feed and I'm getting a good experience and I'm like buying into this, I reckon I would be much more likely to buy a subscription in that instance or a one-off transaction to watch the game if I was brought to the platform that way. But if you get me onto the platform and then I've got to sign up and open up two-factor authentication and all this other stuff you've got to do before you can get on, you're just going to lose more people than you're going to get, and that's where you see a massive drop off in any subscription platform. So more tactics to get people on their own channels and give them free content. It can also be making some of these events for free if you have enough games, right? So if you've got the whole Champions League, you could put 1 or 2 games a week on the platform for free, generate a little bit of income from ads, but get people on the platform knowing you've got those rights, because a lot of people next year won't even know who Paramount is in many markets, and
Yeah.
we'll have to educate them and get them onto the platform somehow. So that could be a tactic they could try.
Well, the other thing that you've spoken about, and just going to put it out there again for anyone that hasn't listened, Major League Baseball, I know does this. I think the NBA does it. Start doing team passes. Maybe I wouldn't pay. We talked about the UK is not going to go to a D2C Premier League product, but say Sky said instead of paying the full price, if you pay half the
Mm.
price, you'll get to watch all of your team's games. That's I think one of those things we talked about
Yeah.
being innovative in your pricing structures where sometimes it's an all-in approach where maybe you could just get a halfway approach where it's just, I don't want to watch the other teams, but can you give me something so I can just watch my teams, get a little bit of something as opposed to getting nothing from somebody. I think that's one of the examples
Yeah.
you've highlighted is really nice.
Yeah, I love that concept, and I'm really surprised it's not. And do wonder why a little bit. I could think about the fact that certain platforms, particularly in the UK, well, they don't have global rights packages or the
Yeah.
full rights package, right? So they will have lots of games they will not have available, and that could frustrate fans potentially as well. Inherently, subscription products are a bit of a there's a bit of a what do you call it, like a an untold story that obviously when you get a subscriber, a lot of them just they hibernate. They basically are actually active. So offering more value like this that people aren't consuming can be a tactic. If they think that offering more like that, there's like more critical mass of games, is
Yeah.
more likely to make people to subscribe, and having more hibernate, it's not the right word I'm looking for, dormant, that's the word,
Yeah.
dormant subscribers, that might be a tactic. But I do love the idea of having a team-based specific product. I'd love to see someone like carve out, actually the Premier League, like carving out, all right, so Sky, you've got all these rights for live games, but
Yeah.
all 300, every game that Man
Yeah.
United's playing is available exclusively on this OTT product. I think you would be shocked at how many people would buy that, particularly if it was global. Oh my gosh, it would go gangbusters given the amount of fandom I've seen for the Premier League right across the world. So
Yeah.
I'd love to see that come to market soon. The market is well overdue, but with the rights spread everywhere. I think it's tricky to get to that point just yet.
Yeah. And then the last question I'll sort of lead this all off on, Nick, and we're talking about piracy and just some of the challenges. Does piracy drive more people or drive the business of sports towards more D2C products? Or does it actually harm the idea of moving more to D2C? Because, we talk about these things, does a model does this help it or does it collapse? Because I think one of the arguments we talk about is the more fragmented you are, the easier you are to pirate stuff because your stuff's in more places. We've also talked about fragmentation, just simply the experience of it could drive people. Let's just go to one platform. So I guess Nick, just broadly speaking, because that could almost be a conversation itself. Does piracy help the argument for going D2C, or perhaps collapse that argument?
Oof. Look, interesting one. I'll try and answer it. I would say that if you're able to fight piracy really effectively to make it really difficult for people to get a good viewing experience through pirated channels, then I think it can really be a driver to go, look, I'm sick of this. I might need to actually pay for the rights. And that can be the way. I don't think people getting on easily on pirated channels and knowing people that can get access to it would help their cause of getting people to subscribe. I think that's basically, if it's too easy, it's basically a long road back. Unless you can offer something of real value from an experiential perspective on the platform that basically can't be offered in a pirated stream. But some of the pirated platforms are fully fledged subscription propositions with multiple channels, hundreds of channels from across the world, including OTT style products. I mean, they can offer more rights and more than any major broadcaster because they're doing it illegally. So it's so difficult for some people to usurp them if people have started really leaning into the pirated world of content, and that's one of the challenges that exist. So I think it is unequivocally having a negative impact on the industry. If piracy didn't exist, I would love to see how different the dynamic of audiences would be. I'd imagine these numbers we've been talking about today would look a lot higher, and people would look at sports in a completely different way because there'd be an acceptance of that investment. But when you know you can get it elsewhere, of course, people aren't going to want to pay.
Yeah. Well, Nick, I genuinely, anytime I can talk about piracy, I love the conversation because it opens up so many different worlds where you can talk about the technology, we can talk about monetization, we can talk about improving user experience. I think piracy is such a great topic. Obviously lined up quite nicely with the Champions League and just the story that came out of the UK about how prevalent piracy was in terms of consumption. It just felt like a good story to kind of remind ourselves where we were at with the Champions League, given some of the moves they've made, talking about moving over to relevant, but also some of those statistics and just having a broader conversation about all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good reminder of how well the Champions League is doing
Yeah.
in many ways, or where the status of it is today, but also how crazy some of the pirated numbers are. So make sure you read that article on the Sports Pro website if you wanted to get a bit more of a written insight into that particular storyline, which I suspect will be one of many more to come around this space, I'm afraid. So let's try and find a solution to piracy, and it'll make our lives all a lot easier with all this extra economic impact that it would have to the sports industry.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, thank you once again for joining us for this episode of Stream Time Sports. We'll catch you on the next one.